Welcome to the Neo-Medieval Ledger. I'm Samuel Dempsey. Today I had the pleasure of speaking with Terrell Jermaine Starr. Terrell is an independent American journalist based in Kyiv and Brooklyn. He speaks Russian, he's currently learning Ukrainian, and he speaks Georgian. He's a renowned expert on Ukraine, Ukraine-US relations, and democracy. He's lived off and on in Kyiv for the last 16 years, and he's a top international Substacker with his Substack, Terrell J-Star Official. We talked about the recent drone attacks in Ukraine. We talk about morale within the country. We talked about what is needed from the EU, the US, and NATO to support Ukraine. We also talked about what it means to fight for democracy abroad when we're fighting for democracy at home. And we talked about the solidarity between the struggle of Palestinians and the struggle of Ukrainians. We also talked about race, something that has unfortunately been weaponized in regards to a Ukrainian refugee. With that, here's my conversation with Terrell. Terrell, it is fantastic to have you on this podcast. So excited to speak with you. So it's been a really eventful week for reasons that are very unfortunate. Starting it off, Russia launched its largest drone attack on Ukraine this past weekend, and Russia is now producing, around 5,000 Iranian drones a month. How is this feeling on the grounds? You're there right now in Kyiv, where you're based, and how are people feeling overall?
In regards to this massive drone attack that recently took place, usually, I would say more often, people dub it as the largest attack since this period or that period. That phrase, the largest drone attack, has been used so often that you lose track of if it was 500 drones or 300 drones or 1,000, whatever, because at the end of the day, it all feels the same. And so here on the ground, it's surreal because I'm in the center of town right now. I'm looking out of my window and I can hear the explosions. And you know that they're close, but they're not close enough to where you can walk per se.
Gotcha.
And you know at any moment it can hit you. And the only reason why you wake up in the morning is that you're lucky. So there are so many instances where you hear the drones hover over your head, fly over your head, and they pass, and you know that they're going to hit something eventually. And so you pray that they're shot down. But people, they really are. There is a fatigue here. It's caused a lot of psychological issues beyond just the drone attack, from a societal basis here. This is a city, a pre-war of 1 million or so plus people. Maybe it was 2 million, I can't recall, but it feels emptier, even though the spirit of the people and the life is still ongoing. It's a different society right now. There is a veterans hospital right behind me, and you see a lot of people with prosthetics. You see a lot of people who basically their lives are changed forever. But the feeling after this recent drone attack, this major drone attack, is really no different from the last. And I think that's what's missing, is that people have just adjusted to the pain and the suffering of war. And I think that the world has grown adjusted to this happening. And what makes it worse is that the United States, under the Trump administration, is doing very little to counter it, even with the lack of sanctions and engaging Russian business community, which is the polar opposite of what they ought to be doing. And so there's also a feeling of incredible isolation that people feel from the rest of the world as well.
Yeah. And with that in mind, these attacks are increasing. And as you're saying, it's becoming kind of a normal thing. And clearly Russia has the capacity to keep doing these. So I guess firstly, on the kind of technical side of things, do you think Ukraine has the capacity to keep defending attacks to this scale? And also then on the, kind of war fatigue and morale side, is the general public, how are they feeling? Are they willing to keep sustaining at this? Because obviously we see greater fatigue happening from allies and those in the West that are supporting. And is that same kind of fatigue hitting like that on the ground?
From a technical standpoint, the Ukrainians definitely need technical support from abroad, mainly Patriot missiles in addition to Patriot batteries. And so roughly there are about 8 or 10 or so that are in operation here right now in Ukraine. In order for it to really have a robust air defense, it would need about 30 of them for a country of this size. Secondly, and so the answer is no. They definitely need outside support, and even if it's not Patriot air defense systems, they need some type of platforms a variety of them, if they're coming from Europe even, in order to protect themselves against these drone and missile attacks. But the problem is that Russia is on a wartime economy. They pretty much have put all of their chips in the middle of the table, right? And so they are betting it all on Ukraine because fundamentally, this country means more to Putin than it does to Brussels or it does to Washington. That's really the bottom line. And until that dynamic changes, Russia is going to always have the incentive because they care more, because for all their ahistorical diatribes about Ukrainians and Russians being brothers and all of this, that means something to them. And the Ukrainians, quite frankly, prior to 2021, the Europeans nor the Americans were thinking about them in any meaningful way. And so when the Ukrainians were able to defend themselves so bravely, then it was like, oh man, I didn't realize that the armed forces were so well prepared to defend themselves, and then they realized that the society had advanced a lot further than they realized, because when you looked at 2014, which is when the full-scale invasion, the original invasion began, with Crimea and Luhansk and Donbass being occupied, and the military here was considered a joke. It was considered, a lot of Ukrainian officials would tell me back then that we were a military just on paper. And so people weren't thinking that 10 years later or 8 years later that the military will hold up so much. And so I honestly believe that in many respects, Ukraine is an inconvenience for Europe, because they weren't thinking about talking about EU accession, possible NATO talks in 2022. They were thinking about 1932, 1942, that type of thing. They had Ukraine on their purview 20 years ahead, not now. And then in regards to the society and people, it's complex. You get a lot of the studies that say that people want an end to this war, and I would really ask people to be really careful about how they look at these polls and look at the surveys. The reality is that yes, people are very much tired of this war. I'll tell you one thing that people aren't talking about, and it's actually to a certain degree suppressed here in the local media, is that the draft is very unpopular. And it very much is. And unfortunately, there are issues with corruption ongoing, not the type of corruption in ways that the Russian propaganda likes to talk about it, but there are some serious internalized issues here and reforms and forces that really need to be addressed. And people don't want to be mobilized into that system. And so it's not that people don't want to fight. That's not the issue. And I think that's the number one thing that's not stressed enough. They don't feel like they're going into a competent armed forces, even though it has excelled on the battlefield, all things considered. And then you have people who, and so the society, they want some type of agreement, but here's the issue. What does the agreement look like? When people say they want the war to end, no one really asks them, do you want and under quote unquote reasonable circumstances, what type of land would you just say, okay, I'll give up, right? And so those are not the type of questions that are imposed, but they are conversations that people have in bars or just in private with themselves. So I'll tell you, with me, frankly, there are, I've done a lot of interviews where I would talk to people on record, and then when I turn the cameras off, they say something different. And what they tell me off camera is that, frankly, prior to 2022, people forgot about Donbass. They forgot about Luhansk. Crimea is a little something different, but there are a lot of people from Luhansk and Donbass who have personally told me that much of the country would be okay if Russia actually kept it, because they said, okay, because there's an internal conversation amongst Ukrainians that's happening here that, that requires a great deal of nuance, and it's not going to be fleshed out in a 5-minute segment on media. And so, so just to, put a pin on it, Ukrainians, generally speaking, are not willing to just give up all their territory, the current ones, especially post 2022. That's not going to happen. The Ukrainian people are not going to allow that to happen. And so they want some type of agreement where they can maintain their sovereignty, because if they do say, Russia, yes, you can have all this, then they know that Russia is just going to rearm and they're going to invade again. So they're stuck between a rock in a hard place that requires them to fight on, even though they're severely fatigued, even though there is a massive shortage in men to recruit from. Secondly, and then there's also the societal psychological fatigue. They realize that if we submit right now, then we give up their sovereignty. And so obviously, you know what options Ukrainians are going to take. They're going to continue to fight.
It's interesting you talked about these hard, nuanced conversations that are happening in Ukraine right now. And from the outside, it seems like that nuance of that conversation is not happening from Western leaders. I mean, we saw, I wonder what you think basically about, France and the UK kind of proposing this 40-kilometer buffer zone to kind of freeze things where they are.
That shit ain't gonna happen, man. I mean,
yeah.
you know it ain't. I'm sorry. We know it's. Finish your question, but I know it's not gonna happen.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically that. It's ridiculous. So that's kind of the confirmation that I was expecting, that this is completely disconnected from what's really happening.
They're not. They're not interested in doing it, man. You know that. Do you know? Listen, let's take. I'm sorry, and I'm sorry. I just had to dive in. I mean, I'm so sorry for interrupting, but it's like,
no,
look,
please.
Look, Marine Le Pen, her party is constantly competing to take over the helm of power in France. They're always a threat, right? If France decides that they're going to send troops here, that is going to be a number one campaign talking point, right? And it was when during the last election. We just know recently that the French government collapsed, right? That's something to be that happened. And then you have all these other players that are talking about sending troops. So if you send the troops to the to Ukraine and they fire back, you're in direct conflict with Russia. That's what's going to happen, because Russia is going to fire shots at them and dare them to fight back. And if they fight back, it's automatically going to be a confrontation with NATO. Now, the wording is going to be something to the effect that we're going to send not necessarily NATO troops, or we're not going to send troops from Europe. We're going to send peacekeeping troops. It's kind of stupid because they're European troops. And then secondly, the U.S. is talking about, having some Blackwater type of conversation. And so literally, I mean, Eric Prince, who's essentially a war criminal, okay, you're bringing him in, so you're going to essentially bring him into the fold. And so you're going to privatize Ukraine's security when, in fact, all Biden, and I primarily put a lot of blame on Biden, because all they had to do was give Ukraine everything that they needed several years ago, and we wouldn't be in this situation. But this whole thing about provocation against Russia and nuclear blackmail played a role into them pausing or delaying platforms like that the Ukrainians really needed. And so this is really going back to my earlier point. This country means a lot more to Putin than it does to Europe and than it does to the United States. And so we no longer have a Reagan, who I'm not a fan of at all, right? Both from his foreign policy standpoint and from just as a Black American, just domestically, but he did have very good Soviet policy. Like, I will give that to him, right? And so after Reagan has pretty much set up the Republican Party as a bulwark of defense and support fighting against Russian hegemony, frankly. And then really the last person that comes from that type of legacy was John McCain, right? And so the Republicans don't have that anymore. I mean, the Republican Party, many of their members are essentially bluffers for Putin. And so you have, in a lot of the Republican conservative neoconservative outlooks that they have, they share it with Russian neoconservative orthodoxy. So culturally, the most powerful conservative party, which is the Republican Party in the United States, culturally shares more in common with our enemy than it does with its domestic interests, which is to protect the country from Russian hegemony and the world from Russian hegemony. And that's where we are.
And this Trump, I mean, he, exactly as you say it, he is not on the right side of this. But at the same time, he really wants a Nobel Peace Prize. He wants to be seen as someone who can bring about the end of this. I mean, what would it actually, let's say he actually wanted to bring about the end of this, or that the West in general, I mean, what do you think it actually takes at this present moment? But also, is any of our leaders really capable of doing that right now? Because you talked about in France, for example, that politically this would be kind of career suicide for Macron to be pushing something like this.
Absolutely.
I can't think of, I mean, can you think of another Western leader that could lead something like this where they're domestically safe enough, but also just have the spine to do so?
No, 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 that's the whole thing. Because, when you think about it, because you have to think about the leaders across Europe who have the domestic support, who are strong enough individually, right? Because it's not Stammer, right? It's not Stammer in the UK, right? Because they have a wide range of domestic issues that are happening right now. It's not particularly him, and even his government is not looking particularly like great and outstanding at this point. Let's look at, yeah, right. And so then, you also have the Poles, and the Poles, you saw their last election. They're being a lot more conservative, and then also
Yeah.
they are still picking at grievances with Ukraine, right? Because you know that they have their whole intercultural conflicts over, the World War II with atrocities, and so like that's a whole nother can of worms in insider baseball that requires a whole nother podcast episode. But then which ironically, the Poles do want to get to the point where they're going to be a shot caller because they have their own concerns about Russia. If you look at how much money that they spend on defense, it is enormous compared to their GDP, because they're arming themselves to be the most powerful nation in the EU and in NATO. They're not there yet, right? But they're eventually going to get there. Okay, then you have Germany. You have Merz, who won in a relative, I would say, nail biter, right? Because you have the AfD that gained about 20% of the vote, and I believe a recent poll shows them that they have about an approval rating of about 26%. So no, it's not necessarily Merz, even though he has been relatively strong, at least verbally, right? Even though they're not sending their long range missiles, and I forgot the name of it, it's up to my tongue. But then you have the French. I don't know what Macron is doing. Like, I think that this guy, verbally, I'm happy that he's doing it, but they don't have none of these people are operating on a wartime economy. And in order to get to your question about what it will take, they would have to get on wartime footing along with Russia. And no one is willing to do that. Now, the United States, Trump would be strong enough to do it, but he has no incentive to do it because it's not about strength with him. It's about the idea that he literally views Putin as a peer. He literally wants business opportunities, because Trump is turning America into he's strengthening the oligarchy of the United States right now, because it is one of the most powerful oligarchies in the world. And we don't like to describe America or the quote unquote first world countries as oligarchies because of racism and because of xenophobia. We don't look at white or European nations as being able to have oligarchies because their democracies are supposed to be so strong, when in fact my country is arguably the most powerful oligarchy on earth.
Yes. 100%.
Okay. And so with that, you go down the list, you got the Italians, and again, like, I'm missing the name of the prime minister there, but she's a fascist. Oh, Meloni, yeah, Meloni is a fascist. She could, but they don't. But again, even if somebody just stood up and said, yes, we're going to do X, Y, and Z, and we're going to fully support Ukraine to the teeth, they don't have the defense infrastructure to do it. And so they can, but it would take years for them to develop to that point. And we recently saw news reports of Ukraine being willing to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on defense, particularly with the US. The reality is that I think the number was something like 100 billion or something like that. Our defense industry is not have the capacity to take all those orders that quickly in this shorter period of time that they need it. And so, again, the thing is that we could have from the first day that this war started, operated on a wartime economy in order to accommodate Ukraine. Because here's the bottom line, Sam. If I am a senior foreign policy person that has the ear of the president of the United States, the ear of a reasonable president, right? Forget about Trump, but a reasonable president. Do you really want to destabilize Ukraine on the border of Hungary, Slovakia, Poland, and Romania, Moldova, which is another EU country? Do you really want that instability on the NATO/EU border? No, you don't. And so I think everyone is just kicking the can down the road, putting their heads in the sand and hoping that this will go away. And Putin knows this, but the reality is that it won't. And this war is not going to end during Trump's time. I don't care what anyone says. The war may be frozen, but it's not going to end.
Yeah. And where do you fall on the close the skies debate, or just to add another debate on the frozen Russian assets debate? I mean, these are some things that kind of been floated that are, seen as strategically realistic, maybe, but politically unrealistic. Where do you fall on that?
They should. Like, yes, the West should absolutely freeze Russian assets. The problem with this is it's a money issue. If we take away the military aspect of it, I know that's impossible to do, but work with me. I promise you, I'm going to make a point here. The issue with the United States and its relationship with Russia, even before this war started, had very little to do with the military. It has as much to do with American greed than it does with than it does with Russia being a real military threat. And here's why. Russia washes its money across so many EU capitals. Russia spends millions upon millions of dollars in lobbying money in Washington. Okay. In the United States, there are so many companies that do business with Russia. In order for America to really have a robust stance against Russia, you can't just support Ukraine militarily and then take Russian money and do business with Russian money and pay taxes, okay, and spending US dollars from American corporations to pay taxes in Russia. And that's happening right now. Billions of dollars in taxes are being spent in Russia to do business. And so that has to stop. You can no longer allow Russians to hide their cash in US assets, real estate, right? Set up in banks, stocks, whatever the case may be. And until America really does a self-check on our corporate oligarchy and our corporate-centered capitalism, right? And a lot of people are going to take this as me saying, well, Terrell, you're against capitalism and therefore you are a socialist, you're a communist. I didn't say any of that.
But
And you're listening with your own, you're right.
You can put it right there. They'll say it anyways.
I'm not saying any of that. I'm saying that because our capitalistic society is not a free market, it is a oligarch corporate centered. It opens up the door to us being infested with these Russian dollars that are informing the business community how to proceed. Because quite frankly, they don't care that Ukraine is being bombed and being killed. They care about their profit. And that's where we are. So when you talk about freezing assets, yes, we need to freeze assets, but we need to completely discontinue our economic relationship, the corporate relationship with Russia, because people just want their cake and eat it too, and you can't do that. And that's something that the Russians understand. Even, and so you're kind of having one toe in the water in regards to giving Ukraine military aid, but at the same time, all these business windows are open, and so they can still fund their war with U.S. dollars going through third channel routes to do so. And so I think this is, yes, they need to do it. And as far as it being politically expedient, there's a saying: sometimes you have to lose your job to do your job. And I think the biggest problem is that people believe that the Cold War ended, and the West stopped believing that they were at war with Russia, but Russia never stopped believing that they were at war with the West. They never stopped believing that. And so there is a pause in American thinking that went to the Middle East, that spanned to, we need to focus on the war on terror. And meanwhile, Russia was building. They never stopped the war. The Cold War never ended for them. They hate us. They hate everything we stand for. They've always resisted American hegemony in the world, which I personally have an issue with any type of hegemony. I believe in the multipolar societies in which everyone can coexist with one another in the whole 9 yards. Again, that's a whole nother conversation for another time. But the problem is that we have, with Angela Merkel, for example, who was working during her entire terms in office as chancellor to economically integrate Russia into the European economy, which was a massive mistake, okay? Because all they did was they saw it as weakness, and we got nothing in return for it.
Exactly.
And so that's where we are.
Yeah, no, the integration could have been fine had we recognized that the Russian elite also had to change with it, and we didn't put any pressures for that to happen.
Nope. Zero.
And at the core of that is really the autocracy versus democracy debate. And it seems right now that part of what you're talking about is that we're struggling to fight autocracy abroad because we're not fighting autocracy at home. And part of why this is the case is we have autocratic figures, A, in power, or B, coming to power across Western countries. And so the question would be how do we do that? How do we actually fight? Do we need to double down at home? And tying it closer to your experience in Ukraine, Zelensky just had his own, I would say, small corruption scandal as he tried to kind of remove the independence of some of these anti-corruption watchdogs. But from the outside, it looked like people were in uproar. And very quickly then Zelensky, did a 180 on this and did not end up doing this in the end. I find that to be a sign of a really healthy democracy, actually. I think that seems a lot better than what we're experiencing in our home country. So what do you think are the lessons from that and the lessons overall in how Ukraine is fighting for democracy that we should maybe take and apply back home?
What's really the difference between the fights for democracy in our home country of the United States versus what's happening in Ukraine is that America is a country, our country is one where you have half of the electorate that are very racist, that are really still upset, that still have not gotten over the fact that the Confederates lost the Civil War,
Yeah.
right? Right. They haven't gotten over that fact yet. And then they further are upset that Jim Crow ended effectively in 1968. They're still upset about that. And many of these people are living, they're electing people, they're in elected office, and they are training their children and their grandchildren to be just like them, which is why we see Trump, who is a white supremacist fantasy, attacking and destroying the judiciary as best he can. And he is suppressing his free speech. He's using ICE as a Gestapo, essentially, even against U.S. citizens. And he is also attacking the intellectuals, which is why he's going after universities and people are kowtowing to him. And then you saw the tech leaders at the White House recently. And it really, when you saw them around the table, it kind of reminds you of that famous meeting that Putin had with all the oligarchs, and they were sitting around the table. And remember, there were one of them, the guy of the oil company, Khodorkovsky, the one that kind of stood up to him, and you saw he ended up in prison, okay, right, for a number of years. And the guys, he's in London right now, one of those guys that says he's a part of the Russian opposition, right? So basically, I'm saying confusing with Trump. Trump is an oligarch. Okay, he is effectively functioning as a political oligarch with all the levers, access to the levers and powers of the White House, of the most powerful nation on earth. And so we are seeing a very authoritarian Jim Crow style attack against our democracy. And so because of that, it's really difficult for us to think about how we can best abroad, because one of the things that America is doing, and the reason why you had J.D. Vance holding these alliances with the AFD, Alternative for Deutschland, is that racists around the world, they may not like each other particularly, but they do understand that what keeps them together is their racist ideology over their whiteness, and this fear that they are being that their whiteness is being devalued and they will be replaced. And they are building national coalitions around that, which gets to the point about Ukraine. When you talk about the lessons, it's really about Ukraine has to build relationships in addition to what they're doing in Europe, outside of the traditional European frameworks that they're dealing with, because the European frameworks are failing them. The European frameworks are proven to be unreliable. They know this, but I think that Ukraine has a really great opportunity to build political solidarity movements that challenge all these isms that we're talking about. But I don't think that they are at the level to really appreciate that for a wide range of reasons, because of this war, because of the trauma, because they've never been conditioned to feel like they've had to. And again, that's not a knock against Ukraine, because people want to say no, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that this is an opportunity for Ukraine to really appreciate that they are going to be uniquely strong if they build political relationships that challenge the type of isms, the racism, this international white supremacist framework that is convening amongst themselves to essentially to weaken places like countries like Ukraine. And we saw recently that the Trump administration has kind of gone back and forth on whether to keep Ukrainians in the country, and they said that essentially they can stay until the war ends, right? Which definitely won't end when he's in power. And so the same type of white supremacy that's targeted Black people, Latino people, other minorities is indirectly impacting Ukraine, because when Zelensky asked for more military aid several years ago, Donald Trump Jr. went on Twitter and said that Ukrainians are international welfare queens, and you know what that means. That was something going back to Ronald Reagan. He popularized the term in 1976 when he first ran, which brings up the images of the poor Black person walking around, driving around in a Cadillac and a fur coat and taking advantage of public services, which essentially he used his racialized term to describe Ukraine. And so, when I'm happy we're having this conversation, because I feel like when people are talking, when people are asked this question, they give you this kind of think tank, boiler point conversation. And I think that the discourse that needs to happen is a lot deeper, because these are people who are really fighting for their existence as white people, which ironically lines up with Putin, because Putin constantly, when he talks to his people, talks about Russophobia and the siege mentality. That perfectly lines up with Trump. So why would Trump in any way counter that? Because they are pretty much philosophical peers. I don't think Trump thinks about anything, but his racist pretty much lines up with Putin's, Russophobic nationalism. And so Ukraine, the thing that separates Ukraine is that they don't have all these different separations racially within their country that divides them in a way that divides us. And so you're not going to see a coalition of all Americans uniting against Trump, because half the people pretty much supported Trump, just like you didn't get half the people, voting for Yanukovych. They ran him out in 2014. We elected somebody like that pretty much ran an insurrection, that pretty much oversaw a resurrection. So that's the difference in society.
And this touches on recent news.
Mm-hmm.
We just saw a Ukrainian refugee who was killed in North Carolina. And this story is being swooped up by all the worst actors, it seems, and just used to paint ridiculous narratives. What is your impression of what's happening here? And how should we actually be, understanding what took place?
What happened with this woman, Arena, and that's her first name. And so she was 23 years old and was killed 2 weeks ago, excuse me, by a mentally ill man with a robust, long criminal record, which was tragic. And this guy should not have been out in the public at all, right? And I did a Google search about this woman when the news first broke on Twitter by the MAGA far right. And they weren't saying it in order of support of this woman. They were saying they were literally dragging this woman's corpse through the digital social media verse in order to push their racist agenda. And if you search their tweets, if you search their social media, these are people who said the most horrible things about Ukraine. He's saying that they don't care about Ukraine. And so they don't care about this woman. And I think what somebody like me, what my work is going to be for this week is between writing in my Substack a newsletter and posting videos to talk about this, is that this is a really good opportunity for people like me and people to reach out to the Ukrainians I know to build relationship. And because ultimately the priority is to celebrate this woman's death, right? Because this woman escaped Russia's imposed war in Ukraine, and she's being dragged through the coals of America's white supremacist race war. Okay, right? So they don't care about this woman, but it's an opportunity for us to come together and be people of good faith. And one, don't let these racist narratives divide us. And for my part, I've actually gone on social media, and I've seen a lot of Black people, like influencers, who pretty much were saying that this is tragic, this person shouldn't be out on the street. And so I think what also happens is that I've seen many Ukrainians of good faith in particular who pretty much have said that they know that this woman's death is being used to spread their racist agendas. And that's what we need to call out, because essentially they're creating disinformation And they're expecting the Ukrainians, they're expecting the country to rally around the quote unquote white woman because she's not even, she's not a Ukrainian. She's not a person who was a model. She wasn't any of these things. They're not saying anything about this woman's life. She's not a person. She's a white woman. That's how they're describing her. Okay.
Of course.
And so, and they're using her as a white woman to juxtapose against the guy's mugshot. And quite frankly, I don't even care that the person is black. Like, I don't feel any type of offense or any type of way about, because this is the person who killed her. Okay. Like, that's not the issue. The issue is the intent of how they're using this person's image and what they're trying to do. Right. And so they're really showing that they don't care about this woman's life, particularly with Trump, who has not levied any new sanctions since his administration. If he cared about Ukraine, he would have sent the Valeries here. He wouldn't be forcing Ukraine to sign a minerals deal. He wouldn't be trying to economically pimp out this country if he cared about the people's lives here. He wouldn't invite Putin to the United States, who, by the way, is a war criminal, okay? Who should be arrested, even though the United States is now in the ICC, which they should, which is another conversation. But the man, after they had their personal meeting, went to the media and had a 12-minute or so presser in which Putin spoke first and talked for 10 minutes while Trump spoke for one. So this macho man, right? And I'm not into this whole masculine thing or whatever, but like Trump was quote unquote emasculated, okay, by a man who was much, by a man who was quote unquote much shorter in stature and whatever. So this whole thing about Trump being the real American man and all these other stuff, he was treated like a punk on his own U.S. soil. And so you bring up this woman's death only to pimp her out for your white or your white racism. And I think, fortunately, for what we see online, that's the reaction that most people are seeing, and I think that's a really positive thing.
I mean, and as you said, this instance, nothing about it was racially or ethnically motivated. This was a random thing that happened, and this is just being completely.
How does she know that this woman is Ukrainian? All right, so that's the whole thing. I mean, this man. Look, I live in New York City. I am in New York. Okay, that is my home. There are so many people with mental health issues, and not only in New York City, across the country, and you see them all the time. And most of them are not violent. And you do run into people who are violent. If you are somebody who lives in New York City, you take the train, you know what I'm talking about. And that has a big failure. That's a big failure of America's healthcare system, and not treating people and not having enough facilities that adequately support people. And there is some policy issues with having someone like him on the street. But did this random man go behind this woman and say, oh, she's Ukrainian and and I'm going to stab her to death because I hate Ukrainians? No, because quite frankly, you didn't see this woman's story in the news, because unfortunately in our country, which is so extremely violent already, it happens all the time. So I could totally see somebody saying that this is just a random stabbing, and so I do want to also add that for Ukrainians to look at this murder of this woman and feel frightened and feel like they're not safe anywhere is an absolutely reasonable emotion to feel. So I think that we have in these moments, we have to exercise emotional dexterity in regards to how we are in community with each other and how we're grieving about certain things, because at the end of the day, this woman was failed by a lot of people. So directly, our American, like the criminal legal system in the United States failed her, because this guy shouldn't have been out. There is a public health failure that was structured that this woman led her country and entered into, okay? Because there's a whole thing about safety, which, by the way, Trump doesn't care about, because if he did, he would not have presided over insurrection. He would not have pardoned. I don't know if it's a pardon or he's pretty much reduced to
The
stuff.
J6.
The J6ers, right? So, if he cared about crime, right? And so this is something where we have a chronic systemic failure at every level that unfortunately took this poor woman's life. And what really upsets me is that, as opposed to letting the family grieve and letting people grieve appropriately in and thinking of proactive ways to not only protect future people. This man and Trump is not doing anything to protect people here. He's not doing anything to protect his own countrymen and women. And so we need to we really need to come together. And that's what I'm doing is really difficult, Samuel. It's challenging, but everything that I put out into the world, and you follow me on social media, so you know what I do, is really about how do we build with each other to attack the real culprits. And it's not the black man, as these MAGA people are trying to point out. It's a failed system that Trump is doing nothing about to make better.
Unfortunately, American white supremacy, racism even impacted you personally this last week, I saw in Ukraine. I mean, I don't know if you looked into this woman, but I mean, by the sounds of it, she was American of sorts, but she called you racial slurs on the street. And I mean, what was your reaction to this, seeing someone who should be your kind of fellow brethren in some regard, an American in a country far away, doing this? And then what was the reaction of people around, reaction of Ukrainians overall to this that you saw online or in person? And how did that differ than how other people were, reacting to this story?
So it's really strange. Like I'm looking out my window right now. I'm in the center of Kyiv. So I walk down that street multiple times a week because my studio is on that street. All of my errands. I was going to the post office to send postcards. In fact, I have so many of them right now that I'm going to send out. So like this is my thing. Like I send postcards to folks.
Awesome.
And walking down the street, I was in my full like going through this, going through that, and I just hear this woman yelling these slurs at me. Because the thing is that it's never happened to me. I've been
Never,
living in Ukraine for
ever in Ukraine.
well, I would say it's never like the way that she just like yelled at me like that type of thing. There's a racism here, absolutely. But what I'm saying is that like the degree and the velocity and the volume with which she like directed it at me, that was something very new because what struck me was how clear her English was, which I immediately said, okay, this person is not a Ukrainian, right? So I immediately figured that. So I'm trying to pinpoint her country. So New York is my home, but I was born and raised in Detroit, Michigan. So I understand different accents, Midwestern, what have you. And I'm like, okay, this is definitely an American woman. I'm trying to pinpoint exactly where she's from. And I've never seen this woman before. And a lot of the social media reactions were, Terrell, can't you tell that she was mentally ill? And it was strange to me because in that instance, how am I supposed to know the mental capacity of a person? I know this person yelled the most horrible thing you could say to a black person. I know that. And it was so out of the blue because it's a sunny day and it's the most popular street in Kyiv. And you have a lot of tourists that go up and down that street. And so that's what I'm saying. Like it was just out of place. And I looked at her, I'm like, who are you, woman? And, quite frankly, I yelled some expletives towards her. I'm like, who the fuck are you? I did.
Yeah.
So ran my errand, came back, and this woman is still there. And I asked her, I took out my camera. I'm like, say it to me now. And like, and the whole say it to me again. And that's what people saw on TV. But she said a whole lot of things far worse off camera. And it was a very visceral thing. So I was kind of shaking inside, not because I was particularly afraid, but it was more like it was a shock to the system. And it lasted for about 25, 30 minutes. Right? And my whole thing is, who is this woman? Someone needs to know who she is because I'm thinking she's some missionary. She works for some NGO. I wasn't thinking about her suitcase or anything like that. I'm thinking about a woman who's yelled all these horrible things at me. And I think on the most part across my social media, people are overwhelmingly positive. I did see a lot of the pushback, which was, Terrell, you started off with a headline, which, they're referring to a tweet. And I'm like, it was the tweet was 4 sentences long. And I didn't say the woman was Ukrainian. I did not say anything about the country. I simply said where it took place. And not because I wanted to target Ukrainians, which is a weird correlation. It literally happened there. And the biggest irony is like it happened here, which is a surprise. And like, I didn't have the bandwidth to reasonably think about how am I going to, write this out or whatever, because it was a shocking thing that I really wanted to capture because that was a way for me to like kind of process it and to really kind of figure out like how to heal through it. And I think, one of the things that I'm taking from this is, and I'm happy you asked me this question because I think it's a question about we spend a lot of time talking about solidarity, a lot, like some people, but we don't have a lot of practice in it. And so in practice, how does that look like? And so I my feedback to some people was, I don't think I did anything unreasonable at all and just kind of documenting what I said. And I felt like I was relatively measured given the shocking and situation that happened. And it's really helping me to think of larger conversations of how do we practice being in community with each other. Kind of like thinking about this woman, unfortunately, who was murdered in Charlotte. One of the things that I'm like, the practice of solidarity to me is just simply shutting up. A Ukrainian person saying that I've seen a lot of reactions saying, I don't feel safe anywhere. It's not my place to say he would have killed anyone regardless of whether they're Ukrainian. I don't think that's
Mm.
appropriate. I don't. Given what's happening in their country right now, given the fact that Ukrainians are killed across Europe, random people, these are not cartel people, they're not millionaire people. These are just random Ukrainian refugees, regular human beings who are being killed. And so for a woman to be killed on a train in Charlotte, which by the way, Ukraine does not have that type of crime here. That's another thing. And relatively speaking, Europe is eons safer than the United States compared. Like it doesn't compare, right? And so I would expect a Ukrainian person to have those feelings. So I need to shut up. I need to look at how do I stand in support of those people. And that usually means keeping my mouth shut. And that usually means amplifying how they feel. And I think the same way with me was I wish that some of those people would have taken the time to consider that as a Black person. This woman, this American woman, given everything that's happening in the United States with our Gestapo-style ICE and Trump's white supremacy and his oligarchy and his anti-Blackness and his anti-anything that is white, that when I hear this American woman in Kyiv, ironically, in the most popular, well-known street in the country, that she is bringing that type of hatred that she learned there here, my response was reasonable. And so I think that gives me more opportunities to build, that gives me more opportunity to think about how do I stay in greater community with folks. And that's how I'm moving forward with it, because I think the last point that people are not thinking about, why did that woman feel safe saying that here? Why did she feel comfortable being on that street and saying that to me? Now, how do people respond? There are a lot of people, besides the N-word, there were a lot of people around. I don't think a lot of people understood a lot of what she said. But then there were some teenagers who approached me and said, we don't agree with her. We don't stand for anything that she's doing. So, and then I walked past people and they're like, yeah, this woman is crazy. And then, like later I started processing, okay, this woman does have mental health issues because, there are videos of her across the web of her doing this type of stuff.
Interesting.
Again, yeah, absolutely. This woman, I've had people direct message me and tell me that they've run into this woman in Odessa, which is in the south
Okay,
of the
so
country.
she's
Yes, this
jeez.
woman is traveling the country. And so it makes me wonder if that means that this woman gets a train ticket. She has some capacity to navigate this place. And I don't know if she's a woman who came here 20 years ago and somehow lost her mental faculties or what. But again, this is a mental health issue where I'm pretty sure that she was institutionalized here and they put her out. I don't know, but I know that I don't want her to verbally assault anyone else in any way. And I think that I would hope that in the future that when things like this happen, that we are better practiced and not viscerally getting into our silos and learn how to reach out, because what we do is when we feel attacked, we go to where we feel safe. And sometimes where we feel safer, a manifestation of things, of reactions happen that necessarily shouldn't or don't accurately portray what's happening to us or what we're seeing. And I got hundreds of messages saying, this woman's not Ukrainian, this woman's not Ukrainian. My response is, I never said that she was. In fact, I said the polar opposite. But again, grace requires me to sit back and not respond to everything. Do you think I went back on my social media and responded to everything? No. In fact, I have a whole bunch of content that I'm pushing out between, doing this interview with you and I have other things that I'm working on, but I'm simply saying that because I'm somebody that talks about solidarity, I have to practice the emotional maturity to realize that people are very visceral. And if I'm taking the helm to say that I am going to be a steward of kind of having these cross-cultural conversations, that's going to require me to hold back and not push sin, not react to every social media post, not enter every argument that I'm invited to or not invited to, and build with people of good faith. And the way to end this is the beautiful way to end this is that my majority of experiences in Ukraine have been overwhelmingly positive, which is the reason why I'm here. In 2 weeks, I'm going to be speaking at the Lviv Tech Conference, which is one of the larger tech conferences in all of Europe, to talk about what solidarity looks like. I was invited to I've been invited to deliver a 40-minute talk in Lviv about what solidarity between Ukrainians and Black people across the diaspora can look like. And so there were organizers of one of the biggest conferences in this country who felt that I was qualified to have that discussion with their leaders. And so that's an honor. So those are the Ukrainians that I'm building with, right?
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Incredible.
So that's what I'm saying. So yeah.
And it's, I think it's important. I'm an American who's living in Europe, and unfortunately there is the trend of a lot of white Americans who choose to live in Europe because they want to be in a place where there's a lot of white people.
And they think you're their buddy. And they think
exactly. And that's why I know they exist, because they come up to me and they say some things. I'm like, no. But it's an unfortunate trend. But I really appreciate you talking about this. And I do want to close with a question about solidarity. You're on the ground seeing the struggle of Ukrainians. You're also very outspoken about the struggle of Palestinians. And the question is really, how do you view both of these struggles? What is the narrative that you think is there? Because I think oftentimes right now, unfortunately, the narrative and, for the general public is they get kind of pitted against each other and told from both sides they're maybe too complex to be understood in a certain way. And therefore there's blame put on, those that are really struggling. So how do you view this? And how also do you think progressives should view and structure conversations around the struggle of Ukrainians and Palestinians?
Samuel, I'll tell you, I have always believed in moral consistency. I have always believed that I am someone that is against Western imperialism. If you listen to any of my social media enough, you have heard me say that I think George Bush is a war criminal. I think he needs to be in The Hague. 100%. What he did in Iraq. I'm not going to argue with anybody, but he's a war criminal. And if I saw him, I call him a war criminal. He is. He is. What I think happens with a lot of people on the left, and I'm somebody who's left leaning. I mean, I'm going back home at the end of October, and I'm going to put Zoran Memdani. I'm going to run to the polls, early vote, and say Zoran Memdani and put my things. So that's where I'm very clear, and I'm going to be very proud to do it. However, I think the problem with a lot of progressive people is that we have, a lot of progressive folks. And that's the whole thing about progressives. My progressivism it comes from the Black experience, like the Black American civil rights experience. When I think about progressivism, I think about Frederick Douglass. I think about the Black Republicans before the party became extremely racist and anti-Black, right? I think about the Black Panther Party. I think about SNCC. I think about a wide range of people whose names will never be in the history books. This hundreds years legacy of Black people who are fighting for democracy, right? The reason why we have the democracy we have in America, and I believe this with all my heart, and I think that the facts stand up to it, is that Black people have sacrificed their blood and their body for the betterment of everyone, right? People think about Susan B. Anthony when they think about women's rights. I think about Sojourner Truth, right? Who was also a Black feminist, around that time, who advocated for women's suffrage for every woman. So Black people have always been ahead of the curve when it comes to the liberation of all people. That is where my progressivism comes from. It doesn't come from people who label themselves socialists, this, that, and the third, which is perfectly okay, right? I don't have a problem with that. In fact, I think we need more socialism in America. I'm I'm fine with it, right? In fact, I've had a lot of positive experience with socialized medicine in Europe. You're not going to have me to fight against it. But I think what happens with Ukraine, however, is that people look at NATO, very rightfully so, and the European Union in the history of its members with colonialism around the world, right? And we do need to address that. We do need, Africa, the continent needs reparations.
Yes.
Europe needs to pay reparations to all the places that colonized in Asia and South America. Again, no argument, but that's not the only type of imperialism that exists. Okay, there's Russian imperialism. The Soviet Union was a settler colonial state. That's all it was. The Russian Empire is a settler colonial state, and the biggest irony is that Russia's imperialism and colonialism predates America's. Okay, and Siberia is not indigenous Russian land. Those were Asian people that Russia slaughtered and killed in order to turn into Russia, essentially. And so when you think about imperialism, you think about the Chinese and the Uyghurs, okay? And so I don't have this singular focus on Western imperialism, and I don't have a problem with America. I don't have a problem with America supporting Ukraine. People are saying that the mass industrial complex, look, I find a lot of hypocrisy in a lot of these progressive voices who essentially are talking about Western weapons being used that have been used in, let's say, Israel, right? And saying, okay, we're sending these same weapons to Ukraine, which I don't think it makes sense. I think that you can just block sending weapons to Israel, right? You can do that, which should happen, versus giving Ukrainians what they need to defend themselves, which, it should happen, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And I also think that, you know, black folk, I find it interesting, like, before I get to the whole thing with black people, I think that a lot of these people who are graduates of Western institutions that have their own histories and legacies of racism are making these arguments. I find it pretty
Mm,
ironic. So my point is that all of us in one way or the other have used the master's tools in order to navigate our lives one way or the other, right? And so I just find a lot of hypocrisy in that conversation. And, I think that a lot of these people also spread Russian propaganda.
yes.
I think that there is something in a lot of these people's minds where they believe that Russia was truly what was truly all for the proletariat. And if you talk to people here, the proletariat was starved to death, right? With the Holodomor, and they don't see the evils in Russian imperialism because they don't think Russian imperialism is their enemy, which in fact is not the case because, as we said earlier, Russia never stopped being at war with us. And I think that there is something in a lot of these kind of liberal people's, like, commentators' minds where they feel that the nuclear missile that's going to be deployed and fired in our direction is going to just completely just weave around them because they're anti-imperial, because they're anti-Western imperialists, right? I
They
think
got
it's
hammer and
that.
sickle in the bio. They'll be
Right,
okay.
right. They'll be okay, right? No, they're trying to destroy all of us. And I think what we really need to do, we can both go against the industrial military complex, right? We can do that while also maintaining a robust defense. We can have all of these things domestically that, in many respects, I agree with them on, while making sure that countries like Ukraine have what they need in order to be safe. I don't see the confusion. I don't see the contradiction in that. But I think that these people are also very stubborn and the same type of arguments that people are closed-minded, directing that to people say like me, they hold that towards anyone else because I'll tell you the I'll put the kicker on it. Going to say Palestine. I was there in 2023, so I was there before October 7th. I was in the West Bank. It's a straight up occupation. It's a straight up it's a straight up apartheid state. Was there for more than a week, returned back to the States. I started tweeting about it. I lost 50,000 followers on Twitter. 50,000. And, the Israeli lobby, and again, that's another phrase that people like to accuse you of anti-Semitism on. No, definitely, there are a variety of lobbying groups that invest in people's interests from all countries, right? I mean, America has lobbies. Russia has a lobby, right? So the Israeli government lobby, they have a very robust media ecosystem that targets people like me. Um, in 1 week, I had 3 different articles written about me, consecutive days.
Hmm.
Members of the Kisnet targeting me, call me an anti-Semite to high heaven. And it was really, if you're not used to handling that type of attention, it could be really overwhelming. And it could be a little bit scary because the attention, everybody is like pointing at you. Um, and there are a lot of the followers, interestingly enough, were people who said that they were pro-Ukraine, right? So they're saying, we liked you when you were talking about Ukraine, but you don't know what you're talking about in regards to Palestine. You don't know the history. You don't know this. I said, okay, you know what's really interesting? We never require people to know the history between Russia and Ukraine dating back 300 years. We never required that understanding with them. But somehow you have to be a PhD in Middle East studies to understand what's going on between Israel and Palestine, right? You see the contradiction. And so I think the big thing, too, is that a lot of these anti-Ukraine people are people who say NATO is the problem. They don't know anything about Ukraine, but they arrogantly talk like they do. A lot of you people who are pro-Ukraine don't know anything about Palestine, haven't even gone, which I got a lot of flack from people who've never been to that part of the world, right? To see it for themselves. Because if you've gone there and you see how the IDF treats those little children, it's a straight up occupation, right? And it's inhumane. And so there's honestly there's a price to be paid for that, because I feel like if I just kind of took money from APAC and did the traditional, hey, we need to make sure that there's a Jewish state. We need to make sure that there is we need to defend Israel's right to defend itself, blah, 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 that whole line, without being critical of their war crimes and their atrocities at all. I would be very comfortable right now, because they would love to have a Black person like me going to Israel and going to Gaza, because they going to Gaza and say, hey guys, everything is fine. You see this, you see this, you see that. They don't want me to listen to Ali. They don't want me to listen to Muhammad, right? They want me to be a token for them. And you know what? Russia wants me to be a token for them. I'm not going to be anybody's token. Okay? That's a very lonely position to be in, because you're not going to have access to money, because Russia pays people too, as we all know, right? So that's what I'm saying. All of these people have lobbies. All these people have massive hundreds of millions of dollars that they invest in media to target people like me. And if I do not bend and say, okay, then they just try to, attack me if they can't pay me. And so, but I would rather be attacked, and then 20 years, 30 years down the line, I'm not going to be looking back and saying, I wish I would have done this, or I wish I would have done that. I'm in a good fight. We're doing the right thing. And the people, Samuel, the people who make the most difference in the world are a small group of people, where everybody else benefits, and they don't even know the small number of people who have made their lives better. And I'm going to be just fine building community, doing interviews like this, where somebody will say it is okay to be morally consistent. It is okay to take a stand, because we're not alone. Because the same stand that I take against Israeli war crimes and Russian war crimes is the same stance I take against white supremacy. It's the same stance that I take that makes me stand in solidarity with Ukrainians, with Palestinians, with the Sudanese, right? What's going on in just like Sudan, right? What's going on in Congo. Like, my heart is open to hold hands with everybody, and I'm not going to suspend my moral consistency because of somebody's narrow-minded view of how progressive thinking ought to work.